Hey there, viewers. Have you ever felt like the official story behind someone's death didn't quite add up? Like there was something being hidden from the public? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Today's story comes straight from the person who conducted Gene Hackman's autopsy, and what they discovered about his true cause of death might change everything you thought you knew. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Case That Shouldn't Exist. I've been doing this job long enough to know when a case is going to stick with me. Some deaths are just deaths. Bodies that tell simple stories, where the answers are clear and the paperwork practically writes itself. But some deaths, some of them are different. Some of them settle under your skin the moment you lay eyes on them. Gene Hackman was one of those cases. The first time I saw his name in my file, I thought there'd been a mistake. Gene Hackman, the Gene Hackman. It wasn't every day a Hollywood legend ended up on my table. And it wasn't the kind of case I expected to handle in a place like this. Santa Fe wasn't exactly a crime-riddled city. People here died quietly, of old age, of car crashes on those long, winding desert highways. Occasionally there was an overdose, or the odd murder that made the local papers, but nothing that shook the world. And yet, here he was. The reports were waiting for me when I arrived that morning, a thick file sitting on the metal desk beside my coffee, as if someone had dumped the weight of it there and walked away. I took a sip, set the cup down, and pulled the file toward me, flipping it open with the same practiced ease I always had. But as I scanned the initial details, a familiar unease began curling in my stomach. The official story was simple. Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, had been found dead in their home after days of no contact. A maintenance worker had stopped by, hadn't gotten an answer, and after a little too much silence, called a neighborhood security officer. That officer had looked through the window, spotted the bodies, and dialed 911. Standard wellness check. Except the moment first responders entered the house, something had felt wrong. The bodies had been there for days, that much was obvious. The smell alone would have told them that before they even walked through the door. But what was strange, what caught my attention immediately, was the positioning. Gene had been found in the mudroom just a few feet inside the house, fully dressed, gray sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt, his sunglasses and cane nearby, as if he had just stepped inside, or maybe had been about to leave. His body showed signs of decomposition, but it was different from Betsy's. She had been found in the bathroom, on the floor near a countertop covered in scattered pills. A space heater had been knocked over near her body. Her hands and feet had already begun mummifying, a process that suggested she had been decomposing at a different rate than her husband, which didn't make sense if they had died at the same time. And then there was the dog. The report said it had been found in a closet not far from Betsy's body, curled up like it had hidden itself away to die. No signs of trauma, no obvious reason why a healthy dog would just suddenly drop dead. I flipped to the next page, the preliminary examination from the first medical responders. No visible external trauma on either body. No signs of forced entry in the home, no obvious signs of struggle, no blood. And yet, I exhaled through my nose, rubbing my fingers over my temples. This was supposed to be a simple case. The man was 95, his wife was 65. People their age pass away all the time, and finding couples who die within days of each other isn't unheard of. Sometimes one goes, and the grief takes the other with them. Broken heart syndrome. It happens. But something wasn't right. The 911 call hadn't come from a family member or a concerned friend. It had come from a worker who hadn't been able to reach them for days. Why hadn't Betsy called 911? If Gene had been the first to go, why hadn't she tried to get help? Had she been incapacitated? Did she not want to be saved? And if she had been the first to die, what had happened to Gene? I turned another page and found the preliminary toxicology report. It wasn't complete yet, but there was enough to raise a red flag. They had both been found with traces of sedatives in their systems. I frowned, drumming my fingers against the desk. That could have meant anything. Plenty of elderly people take medication to help them sleep, to manage pain. But then, I glanced back at the notes. The dosage levels in their systems were off. Not quite enough to suggest intentional overdose, but enough to be concerning. I leaned back in my chair, eyes flicking over the scattered pills in Betsy's bathroom, the dead dog, the position of Gene's body. It felt wrong. I glanced at the media reports sitting in a separate pile beside the case file. The public was already calling it suspicious. Every news outlet was running the same angle. Hollywood icon found dead under mysterious circumstances. And even though I hated to admit it, I agreed. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't add up. I closed the folder and pushed it aside, staring at the ceiling for a moment. This wasn't just an old man passing away in his sleep. This was something else. I had examined hundreds, thousands of bodies in my lifetime, each with its own silent story to tell. Some screamed the moment you unzipped the body bag, their causes of death obvious. Others whispered, making you dig a little deeper to find the truth beneath their skin. And then there were the ones like this, the ones that didn't want to be understood. I stood, stretched the stiffness from my spine, and glanced at the metal door leading to the cold storage room. Gene Hackman was waiting for me. I reached for my gloves, snapping them on with the ease of habit. Time to find out what he wasn't telling me. Chapter 2. A body that defies time. The morgue was quiet, the kind of silence that had weight to it, pressing against my ears as I stood before the steel table. Gene Hackman's body lay there, covered by a sheet, waiting. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, their sterile glow casting sharp shadows along the walls. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, stretching them over my fingers as I stared down at the outline of his form beneath the sheet. There was always a moment like this before every autopsy. The brief pause, the breath before the cut, where you acknowledge the life that came before the body on the table. Some people treated these moments with reverence, others with detachment. I was somewhere in between. Death had a way of stripping people down to their simplest forms. Whatever they had been in life, celebrity, criminal, ordinary citizen, none of it mattered now. The body didn't care about legacies. But this time was different. I pulled back the sheet. The first thing that struck me was how intact he was. For a man who had supposedly been dead for nearly 9 days, he was far too well preserved in some places, while in others, decay had taken hold faster than expected. His face was unmistakably him, sunken with time but still bearing the same strong features that had once filled movie screens. His skin had taken on the usual pallor of death, but there were patches, areas where the decomposition looked accelerated, uneven in a way that wasn't normal. I frowned. Something about it didn't feel right. I started with the standard external examination, my hands moving over his arms, his chest, his abdomen. There were no visible signs of trauma, no bruises, no cuts, nothing to indicate foul play. But the inconsistency in the decomposition was already raising questions in the back of my mind. It wasn't just that some areas had broken down faster than others, it was that the rate of decay didn't align with what I expected for a body found under normal circumstances. I turned to my assistant, who stood waiting beside the table, clipboard in hand. "Make a note of the irregular decomposition patterns," I murmured. "We'll need to run additional tests later." She nodded, scribbling it down, but I could see the same unease flicker in her expression. I took the scalpel and made the Y incision, pulling back the skin and muscle to expose the rib cage. The smell of death was strong, but not as overpowering as it should have been. Another inconsistency. I reached for the bone saw, cutting through the sternum to access the chest cavity. The sound of metal against bone was a familiar one, but something about this case was making my hands feel heavier than usual. The first thing I examined was the heart. Given his age and medical history, I expected to find evidence of heart disease, possibly even arterial blockages that could have contributed to his death. At 95, it wasn't a question of if his heart had deteriorated, it was a question of how much. But as I lifted the organ from his chest cavity, a deep, unsettling frown settled on my face. The heart tissue was too rigid, stiff in a way that wasn't just the result of age or natural post-mortem changes. I ran my fingers over the muscle fibers, feeling the unnatural density beneath my gloves. Something had altered the tissue, something beyond the expected wear and tear of old age. My assistant noticed my hesitation. "What is it?" I turned the heart slightly, studying it from another angle. "It's strange." "What do you mean?" I exhaled, setting it down momentarily. "It feels wrong, too stiff, almost like it's been exposed to something that changed the structure of the tissue." She leaned in slightly, her brow furrowing. "You think it's chemical interference?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, but the idea was already taking root. If he had been unknowingly ingesting something over time, it could have altered his body's ability to process and metabolize certain compounds. It could explain the rigidity, the uneven decomposition, the fact that his body wasn't following the rules it was supposed to. I moved on to the lungs next. The moment I cut into them, I knew something was off. They weren't as deteriorated as I would have expected, but they weren't healthy either. There was inflammation in the tissue, the kind I had seen in cases of chemical exposure. It wasn't the result of smoking, wasn't just the natural result of age. It was something else. I pressed my lips together, feeling a slow, creeping unease settle over me. There was no record of Gene Hackman being treated for any kind of respiratory illness recently. No reports of exposure to anything that could have caused this level of inflammation or abnormal tissue development. My assistant was already reading my expression. "You think something was affecting his system before he died?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I moved back to the chest cavity, carefully inspecting the lining of his stomach, his liver, his kidneys. There were no obvious signs of poisoning, but that didn't mean there weren't traces of something more insidious at play. "I think," I finally murmured, staring down at the open body before me. This isn't just old age catching up to me. I straightened, pulling off my gloves as I stepped back from the table. Something had been happening to Gene Hackman in the weeks or months before he died. Something that had been altering his body in ways that weren't obvious to the naked eye. And if that was true, then I had to ask myself the next logical question. Had he known? Or had he been unknowingly exposed to something that was slowly killing him? I glanced at the report again, at the toxicology results that were still pending. A creeping dread curled in my stomach. There was something else inside this body, something that didn't belong. And I had a feeling that once I found it, the truth about what really happened to Gene Hackman wasn't going to be something the world was ready to hear. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Should Have Survived. Betsy Arakawa's body was waiting for me. It lay on the steel table under the cold white light of the morgue, still and silent, her features stiff with death. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and the lingering metallic tang of preservation fluids. The atmosphere was heavy, not just from the weight of what I had already discovered with Gene Hackman, but from the strange inconsistencies that had surrounded their deaths from the moment their bodies were found. Gene's autopsy had already revealed more questions than answers. His heart had been unnaturally stiff, his lungs inflamed in ways that suggested exposure to something foreign, something that hadn't been accounted for in his medical history. His decomposition was uneven, his body preserved in some areas while breaking down too quickly in others. These were details that shouldn't have existed, details that didn't belong. And now, as I pulled back the sheet covering Betsy's remains, I felt a slow, creeping dread settle over me. I had expected her to be in a similar state as Gene. She had died at the same time, after all. If Gene had been affected by something in his system, she should have been too. But the moment I laid eyes on her, I knew something was wrong. Her body looked different. The first thing I noticed was her hands and feet. They were mummified, dried, shriveled, the skin darkened and leathery. It was the kind of preservation effect I had only seen in bodies that had been left in extreme heat or dry environments for prolonged periods. But the rest of her body didn't match. Her torso, arms, and legs showed normal decomposition, similar to Gene's, but her extremities had withered in a way that was completely unnatural for someone who had only been dead for 9 days. This wasn't normal. I bent closer, inspecting the texture of the dried skin, running my fingers lightly over the surface. There was no immediate sign of external damage, no burns or abrasions, nothing that suggested her body had been subjected to an extreme heat source. And yet, her hands and feet had aged far beyond the rest of her body. It didn't make sense. I turned to my assistant, who had been watching quietly, her clipboard held close to her chest. "Make a note of the differential decomposition, particularly in the extremities," I said, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my stomach. "We'll need tissue samples to determine why this happened." She nodded, quickly jotting it down, but I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. I moved my attention to the pills that had been found near Betsy's body. They had been scattered on the bathroom counter, some still inside an overturned bottle, others loose against the marble surface. At first glance, they had seemed like standard medications, perhaps something for sleep, anxiety, or pain relief. But as I examined them now, something felt off. I retrieved a sample of her blood work and toxicology report, already knowing what I was looking for. If these pills had been part of her regular medication routine, the levels in her system should match what would be expected for someone taking them consistently. But as I scanned the preliminary toxicology results, I felt my pulse quicken. They didn't match. Her dosage levels were all wrong, either far too high or barely traceable, as if she had been taking them irregularly or in strange quantities. It wasn't just one medication, either. It was several different compounds, all present in amounts that didn't align with standard prescriptions. I exhaled, setting the papers down for a moment. "What the hell was she taking?" I muttered under my breath. My assistant hesitated before speaking. "Do you think she was self-medicating?" I didn't answer right away. Self-medicating would explain some of it, but not all of it. The levels were too erratic, as if her body had been processing substances in ways that weren't normal. There was also the question of intent. Had she knowingly taken these doses, or had something else been at play? I glanced at the medical history we had on file for her. Betsy had been a health fanatic, someone who had dedicated her life to clean eating, fitness, and longevity practices. She had been a former fitness trainer, someone who believed in alternative medicine, natural healing, and holistic approaches to health. She had never been someone who relied on heavy medications or unnecessary pharmaceuticals. In fact, from what I could gather, she had been opposed to them. I skimmed through the notes about her dietary habits, her strict organic meals, her emphasis on anti-inflammatory foods, her belief in herbal supplements over traditional medicine. She had been obsessed with maintaining health and vitality, especially for Gene. It was clear that she had pushed him to stay active, encouraged him to keep moving despite his age, rejected the idea of letting him decline. But that raised a new chilling possibility. What if the very things she believed would prolong their lives had actually led to their deaths? What if she had unknowingly introduced something toxic into their systems, not through malice, not through intentional harm, but through sheer misguided faith in alternative health practices? I turned back to her body, my eyes scanning her frame, searching for any further abnormalities. Her muscle tone was still relatively intact, another strange inconsistency considering the mummification of her extremities. Whatever had affected her body had done so unevenly. I picked up my scalpel and made the first incision. As I worked, peeling back layers of skin and muscle, I kept expecting to find something obvious, some hidden trauma, some clear indicator of how she had died. But the further I went, the more I realized that her body told an even stranger story than Gene's. Her organs showed no immediate signs of failure, no major clots or hemorrhages, no clear cause of death. And yet, as I examined her liver and kidneys, I noticed anomalies in the tissue, subtle but unmistakable. There were signs of long-term exposure to something foreign, something her body had been metabolizing over time. I glanced at my assistant. "Send tissue samples for additional toxicology testing. I want to know exactly what was in her system." She nodded, quickly marking it down. I knew it would take time for the results to come back, but deep down, I already had a sinking suspicion about what they would show. This hadn't been a sudden death. Something had been happening to both of them, slowly, over weeks, maybe even months. And the fact that their dog had died too, curled up in a closet as if it had been suffering from the same mystery ailment, only made it worse. I looked down at Betsy's lifeless form, at the body of a woman who had devoted herself to preserving life, and yet had somehow ended up here, on my table, surrounded by questions with no clear answers. And I knew with absolute certainty that this case was far from over. Chapter 4. The Dead Dog in the Closet. I hadn't been able to stop thinking about the dog. In the grand scheme of things, it should have been an afterthought. An elderly man and his wife, both deceased under strange circumstances. Those were the headline-grabbing details, the deaths that needed answers. But the dog had been dead too, curled up inside a closet, away from its owners, as if it had hidden itself away before the end came. That wasn't normal. If this had simply been a case of natural causes, a couple passing together in the quiet of their home, what explained the dog? Why would it have died at the same time? I had seen my fair share of cases involving elderly couples who passed within days of each other, their grief manifesting physically, their bodies simply giving out. It happened more often than people realized, but dogs didn't grieve themselves to death in a matter of hours. And that was the problem, the timeline. The reports indicated the dog had died around the same time as Gene and Betsy, not days later. Not from starvation or exposure. It had died within the same window. That was what kept me awake the night before I returned to the crime scene. By the time I arrived at their house, it had been nearly a week since their bodies were discovered. The Santa Fe estate sat in eerie stillness, frozen in time, as if the house itself had yet to acknowledge the deaths inside. The driveway was empty now, save for a single unmarked vehicle, the forensics unit, waiting for me to finish what I had started. I pushed open the door, stepping into the same air that had surrounded the couple in their final moments. The house smelled of dust, of aged wood and lingering death, despite the ventilators that had been running since the bodies were removed. I had read the reports, seen the photos. Gene had collapsed just beyond this entryway, his cane nearby, as if he had been walking towards something, maybe the door, maybe his wife. And Betsy had died in the bathroom, surrounded by scattered pills. My eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the bathroom, then toward the other side of the house, the closet where the dog had been found. The closet had always bothered me. Dogs didn't just hide themselves away unless something was deeply wrong. It wasn't like them to seek out isolation before death. They stayed near their owners, near familiarity, near warmth. So why had this one died alone? I knelt down, running my gloved hand along the floor, looking for any small details that the crime scene photos might have missed. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that the dog had been forced inside. The door had been slightly ajar when responders found it, which meant the dog could have left. But it didn't. It stayed. I pulled out my flashlight and flicked it on, scanning the edges of the closet, the floor, the baseboards. Then I saw it. Faint, almost invisible to the naked eye. A small, powdery residue near the corner. I straightened, my pulse picking up. The dog hadn't just died in here. It had been in contact with something. I took a swab sample, sealing it in a test tube before moving back to the hallway. The toxicology report for the dog had already come in, and it had revealed something even more unsettling than I had expected. The dog's system had contained elevated levels of a sedative, the same compound that had been found in Betsy's system. That wasn't a coincidence. I turned back to the bathroom, stepping inside, scanning the floor, the countertop, the scattered pills. The pills weren't just strewn about carelessly, they had been placed. Suddenly it was all starting to take shape in my mind. I exhaled sharply, the realization settling in my chest like a weight. The dog had been exposed to something, the same thing that had been in Betsy's system, but how? There were two possibilities. Either it had accidentally ingested something intended for Gene and Betsy, or it had been intentionally exposed. If someone had given the couple something to ingest, something that had been slowly affecting their bodies over time, could the dog have eaten it too? Had it licked up the residue from a spilled dose, or had it been deliberately sedated, tucked away, made to disappear before the end? I stepped back from the bathroom counter, my mind racing. There was another possibility. What if the dog had been locked in the closet on purpose? Someone could have placed it there knowing it would die, knowing it wouldn't make noise. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I looked back toward the empty house, the stillness pressing in on me from all sides. If that was true, if someone else had been involved in this, someone who had orchestrated their deaths, who had done it, and why? Had Betsy realized what was happening too late? Had she taken the pills as an act of desperation, trying to counteract whatever had been happening to her? Or had she simply been the final victim, unknowingly consuming something that had been tainting their lives for months? I walked back toward the front door, pausing at the spot where Gene had collapsed. Had he been trying to get out? Had he realized in those final moments that something wasn't right? I glanced down at the space where his body had been, then at the door leading outside. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint smudge on the doorknob, one that had been overlooked because it had faded with time. It was oily, barely visible, but still there. Something had been on his hands when he fell. Something had been on the doorknob. Something had been inside this house. I exhaled slowly, my breath steady, but my pulse pounding. This wasn't just an old man and his wife passing away peacefully in their home. This was something else. And whatever had happened here, it wasn't over yet. Chapter 5: The Vortex and the Unseen Influence. I was beginning to understand that whatever had happened to Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had been set in motion long before the night they died. There was something deliberate about it, something insidious. It wasn't just the inconsistencies in their bodies, the unusual decomposition, the unexplained substances in their systems. It was the way every single clue pointed to something hidden beneath the surface, something neither of them had likely recognized before it was too late. I was sitting in my office, surrounded by reports, forensic photographs, and stacks of medical records, but my mind wasn't on the science. It was on Betsy. Gene's death had been strange, but Betsy's was the real key to understanding what happened. Her body had been far more affected. The mummified hands and feet, the erratic toxicology results, the high levels of substances in her bloodstream that didn't match any prescription records. It was almost as if her body had been deteriorating in a way that wasn't natural, as if something had been wearing her down before she even died. And that was when I came across something in her personal history that made me stop cold. Betsy had been a believer in Santa Fe's spiritual vortex. I had read about these before, locations believed to hold concentrated energy, places where people claimed to experience healing, heightened awareness, and deep spiritual connections. Santa Fe, where she and Gene had chosen to settle, was known for this. Some people saw it as nonsense, a tourist attraction for the spiritually inclined, but others, people like Betsy, saw it as something real. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Betsy wasn't just interested in alternative medicine. She had fully immersed herself in it. She had spent decades rejecting traditional pharmaceuticals, turning instead to herbal remedies, holistic treatments, and unregulated supplements. She had pushed for Gene to stay active, to keep moving despite his age, to avoid doctors unless absolutely necessary. And then I found something else. She had been in contact with a health practitioner just months before her death, someone who specialized in body purification methods. The phrase made my stomach turn. I started pulling every bit of information I could find about who Betsy had been seeing, what kinds of treatments she had been following. What I found was a deeply disturbing pattern. Betsy had believed in detoxing the body through alternative methods, some of which included fasting, herbal cleanses, and ingesting certain minerals and compounds believed to purge toxins. But the problem with some of these purification methods was that they weren't just ineffective, they could be outright dangerous. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the toxicology reports again. What if Betsy had been unknowingly poisoning herself and Gene? She had spent years obsessing over health, over longevity, believing that the right combination of supplements, foods, and rituals could extend life. But what if the very things she had been consuming were slowly killing her? The chemicals found in her system weren't typical of prescription drugs. They were organic compounds, naturally occurring substances that in small doses might not be immediately harmful, but over time, they could do irreversible damage. I thought about the dog, dead in the closet, its system showing the same sedatives that had been found in Betsy. Had the animal accidentally consumed something intended for Gene and Betsy? Had it been exposed to the same dangerous compound, something that was meant to cleanse the body? Or worse, had Betsy started realizing too late that whatever she had been taking wasn't working the way she thought? Had she panicked? Had she taken more, hoping to counteract the effects, not realizing she was accelerating the process? I picked up my phone and dialed the contact listed under her recent medical records, the alternative health practitioner she had last visited. The woman who answered had a soft, calm voice, the kind that sounded like it belonged to someone who believed in healing crystals and herbal teas. I identified myself, asked about Betsy. I expected hesitation, maybe even resistance, but the woman didn't seem surprised to be getting a call about her. Betsy was a wonderful person, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. She truly believed in natural healing. She wanted to live a long, full life. That's why she started the regimen. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. What regimen? There was a pause. She was detoxing. Detoxing from what? Another pause. She never said exactly, but she was worried about environmental toxins, about things in the air, in food. She wanted to keep Gene as healthy as possible. She was taking a mineral-based supplement to cleanse heavy metals from the body. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. A mineral-based supplement? I had seen cases before where people poisoned themselves slowly without realizing it. Certain heavy metal detoxes contained compounds that in small doses might not cause immediate harm, but over time they could accumulate in the body, leading to severe organ damage. Betsy had been trying to prolong life, but instead, she had been slowly destroying her body from the inside out, and Gene had been right there with her. I hung up the phone and rubbed my temples, trying to piece it all together. Had she realized in those final days that something was terribly wrong? Had she tried to stop taking whatever she had been consuming, but it was too late? Had Gene? I glanced at the forensic photographs of their bodies, at the inconsistent decomposition patterns, the signs of chemical interference in Gene's heart and lungs, the rapid mummification of Betsy's extremities. Their deaths hadn't been an accident. but they also hadn't been intentional. Betsy had spent her life chasing longevity, believing that if she just followed the right regimen, she could keep Gene healthy, keep herself young, defy time itself. But time doesn't work that way, and the vortex she had put her faith in, it hadn't healed her. It had buried her. Chapter 6, The Toxic Truth. The toxicology report came in the next morning. I had been expecting it, dreading it. The results would confirm what I already suspected, but that didn't make it any easier to face. The pages were still warm from the printer as I spread them out across my desk, scanning the long columns of chemical compounds, breakdowns of foreign substances in their systems. My stomach tightened the moment my eyes landed on the highlighted results. They had been consuming something for months, possibly even years. It was in their blood, in their tissues. Gene and Betsy hadn't been poisoned all at once. It had happened slowly, gradually. The compound in their systems was one I recognized, though it wasn't something commonly tested for in a standard toxicology screening. It wasn't an outright poison, not in the traditional sense. It was a mineral-based supplement, often marketed as a natural detoxifier, a way to cleanse the body of harmful toxins. But in high doses, it did the exact opposite. I exhaled, pressing my fingers to my temples as I absorbed the information. It had been in their food, their drinks. Not a single fatal dose, nothing dramatic enough to cause sudden death. No. This had been accumulating in their bodies over time, building up until their organs simply couldn't process it anymore. That was why Gene's heart was unnaturally rigid, why his lungs showed signs of chronic inflammation. That was why Betsy's body had decomposed differently, why her extremities had mummified faster than the rest of her. Their systems had been slowly shutting down, little by little, and they hadn't even known it was happening. I thought back to everything I had uncovered about Betsy's devotion to alternative medicine, holistic healing, detox regimens. She had spent her life trying to preserve her health, trying to keep Gene healthy, believing that she was extending their lives when in reality, she had been shaving years off of them. I flipped back to the records of her last known visits to alternative health practitioners. Had she ever been warned? Had anyone ever told her the risks? I already knew the answer. People who believed in these things didn't think they needed to be warned. They believed they were doing something good for themselves, something better than what conventional medicine could offer. They believed the body was meant to heal itself, that if you just ate the right foods, took the right supplements, avoided the right toxins, you could live longer, healthier, stronger. But the human body doesn't work that way. It still had limits, it still had breaking points. And Betsy and Gene had unknowingly crossed that line long before their bodies finally gave out. I turned to the final section of the report, feeling my throat tighten as I read the last few lines. The compound found in their systems wasn't something FDA approved or regulated. It was sold as an herbal detox, often used in cleansing treatments, despite the fact that long-term exposure could cause gradual organ failure. That was it then, that was the answer. Betsy had been dosing both of them, thinking she was protecting them from something unseen, when in reality, she had been introducing the very thing that would kill them. Had she felt it happening? Had there been signs? Had there been moments where she'd woken up feeling unwell, chalking it up to old age, to stress, to anything other than the truth? At Gene, I thought about the last moments of their lives. Gene collapsed in the mudroom, fully dressed, sunglasses and cane nearby. Had he been about to leave? Had he realized something was wrong? Was he trying to get help? And Betsy, alone in the bathroom, surrounded by scattered pills, her body already showing the first signs of accelerated decay. Had she taken more, thinking she could reverse what was happening to her? Or had she simply succumbed before she could even try to save herself? And then there was the dog. The report had confirmed it. The same substance had been in its system, though in a smaller amount. Had it gotten into their food? Had it been licking the floors, eating scraps, drinking water that had been laced with whatever they had been consuming? It was all connected. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't murder, not in the way people thought. There had been no killer, no one who had forced them to ingest something against their will. But it was still a crime. A crime of misinformation, of blind trust, of believing in something so deeply that it ultimately killed them. I thought about the media coverage, the speculation. People were looking for foul play, for some kind of outside force, a person who had orchestrated this. But there was no one else. Only them. Only the choices they had made, the things they had put into their bodies, believing they were safe. I had my answer. But it wasn't the kind of truth that would bring anyone comfort. It was the kind of truth that would make people question everything they thought they knew about the things they trusted, the health fads they followed, the supplements they took, without hesitation. And I wasn't sure if the world was ready to hear it. Chapter 7. The silent hand behind it all. The truth was in front of me, staring back from the toxicology reports, the autopsy findings, the case files stacked on my desk. But knowing the truth and understanding it were two different things. Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa hadn't been murdered, not in the way the world wanted to believe. There was no masked intruder, no act of violence, no deliberate poisoning by some outside hand. And yet their deaths weren't accidents either. They had been dying long before their bodies were found, long before Gene collapsed near the mudroom and Betsy fell in the bathroom. Their bodies had been breaking down for months, maybe even years, and neither of them had realized what was happening. The substance found in their systems had been marketed as a healing agent, an all-natural compound meant to cleanse the body of toxins, to purify the bloodstream, to rid the organs of harmful metals. It had been sold as a key to longevity, a way to extend life rather than end it. But at high doses, over prolonged exposure, it did something else entirely. It poisoned them from the inside out. It had hardened Gene's heart, inflamed his lungs, interfered with the way his body functioned at a fundamental level. It had done even worse to Betsy, accelerating the decay of her extremities, leaving behind those unsettling signs of mummification that defied normal decomposition. But there were still questions that refused to be answered. Betsy had been found alone in the bathroom, her body surrounded by scattered pills. That detail wouldn't leave my mind. The pills weren't carelessly knocked over. They had been placed, almost deliberately, like a message waiting to be read. Had she known? Had she realized too late what had been happening? The image haunted me. Betsy standing in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection, feeling her body weakening in ways she couldn't understand. Gene struggling to walk, to breathe, to think clearly. The slow unraveling of their health, symptoms creeping in so subtly they might have thought it was just old age catching up to them. I thought about the last moments of their lives. Gene, fully dressed, his cane and sunglasses nearby. Had he been about to leave? Had he finally felt something was wrong enough to seek help, or had he simply collapsed, unaware that his body had already passed the point of no return? Had Betsy walked into the bathroom, realizing too late that something had been poisoning them all along? Had she reached for the pills, desperate to stop it, only to succumb before she could do anything? Or had someone else been there? That thought chilled me in a way that nothing else had. The supplements Betsy had been taking weren't standard over-the-counter vitamins. They were part of a larger movement, an entire industry built around the idea that modern medicine was the enemy, that natural remedies were the key to immortality. These weren't prescription drugs, regulated and tested. They were sold through private channels, by people who made claims they couldn't scientifically prove. I needed to know where Betsy had been getting her supply. I pulled up the last known contacts in her phone records. The alternative health practitioner she had been seeing had already told me about her detox regimen, but I wasn't convinced she had told me everything. I made the call. The woman answered on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar, calm. Too calm. "I was hoping I'd hear from you again," she said. I let a beat of silence pass. Why's that? Because I knew you'd have more questions. She wasn't wrong. Betsy was a believer, she continued, her tone gentle, like she was reminiscing about an old friend. She truly believed in what we were doing. She wanted to keep Gene healthy, to keep herself strong. She wasn't afraid of modern medicine, she just knew it wasn't the only way. She trusted in nature. I gripped the phone tighter. The substances found in her system, did she get them from you? A pause. Then, she got them from a supplier I work with. It's all perfectly safe when used correctly. But she wasn't using them correctly, was she? More silence. Then something that sounded almost like a sigh. Betsy was enthusiastic. Sometimes people think that if something is good in small doses, then more must be even better. But that's not how these things work. My stomach twisted. So you knew, I said. I knew she was passionate about the regimen, she corrected, her voice still calm. She truly believed she was doing the right thing. I can't control what people do in their own homes. But you gave her the supply. Another pause. She made her own choices. I felt my jaw tighten. That was the problem, wasn't it? She had made choices, but she hadn't understood what those choices really meant. I had heard this excuse before. I had seen cases like this before. People who believed in alternative medicine so fiercely that they ignored the warning signs until it was too late. And the people who supplied them, the ones who sold the supplements, who promoted the regimens, who spread the idea that natural meant safe, always washed their hands of responsibility. Betsy had believed, she had trusted, and in the end, that trust had killed her in Gene. I knew I wouldn't get anything else from the woman on the phone, but there was still one last question clawing at the back of my mind. The pills in the bathroom. Had Betsy arranged them herself? Had she realized at the very end what had happened to them? Or had someone else placed them there? There were no records of anyone else being in the house, no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. But that didn't mean no one had been there. The supplier, the one who had provided the very thing that poisoned them. Had Betsy called them in a panic? Had she asked for help, only to realize that the people she trusted weren't going to save her? Had someone come to that house to make sure there were no loose ends? I wasn't sure I'd ever know. There would be no arrests, no charges filed, because technically no crime had been committed. There was no law against buying into a lie. No law against trusting the wrong people. The truth of what happened to Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa would never be officially recognized for what it was. But I knew. And now, so did the world. Chapter 8. They lied to you. The final report was filed at 3:42 p.m. on a Wednesday, a clean and clinical summary of events, carefully worded to leave no loose ends. Cause of death: natural causes with underlying complications from age health issues. That was it. That was the truth the world would be given. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, the words blurring slightly as the weight of the case settled over me like a dense fog. I had known this would happen. I had known from the moment I held Gene Hackman's heart in my hands, felt the unnatural stiffness of his tissue, saw the inflammation in his lungs, the way his body had fought against something it didn't recognize. I had known from the moment I saw Betsy Arakawa's hands, blackened and mummified, a grotesque contradiction to the rest of her body. From the second I saw the scattered pills in the bathroom, the silent plea in their arrangement. And yet the report said, natural causes. The truth, the real truth, was too strange to be told. No one would ever officially say that Gene Hackman had been poisoned slowly, over months, maybe years, by a health regimen meant to save him. No one would write that Betsy, in her unwavering belief that she was extending their lives, had unknowingly been feeding them something that was killing them both from the inside out. That the very thing she thought was purifying them had been accumulating in their bodies little by little until it reached the tipping point. No one would ever publicly acknowledge that the substance found in their systems was a known risk in high doses, that it had been sold as a miracle cure despite having no real scientific backing, no regulation, no oversight. Because people didn't want to hear that story. The world wanted a clean ending. It wanted a neat obituary, a Hollywood legend, passed peacefully in his home. No controversy, no lingering questions. Just an old man leaving the stage one final time. I could already see the headlines, a quiet death, a tragic but natural conclusion to a long life. But I knew better. Gene Hackman didn't just die. And Betsy Arakawa wasn't just another grieving spouse who went soon after. They had been lied to, fed the idea that natural meant safe, that supplements and detoxes and energy cleansing could keep them alive longer than any doctor, any prescription, any piece of modern medicine ever could. And they weren't the only ones. People did this every day, trusting holistic cures that were never properly studied, drinking tonics that promised immortality, swallowing pills that weren't what they seemed. And every once in a while, someone paid the price for believing. Maybe Betsy had realized too late. Maybe she had looked in the mirror one day, noticed the way her body wasn't responding the way it used to. Maybe she had tried to stop, but by then the damage had already been done. Maybe Gene had felt it creeping in, the exhaustion, the slowing of his body in a way that wasn't just age catching up to him. Maybe he had reached for his cane, for the door, because something inside him was screaming that he needed help. Or maybe they never figured it out at all. The dead don't tell their stories. That's what I do. That's what my job is. But this time I couldn't. Not really. Because people don't want stories like this. They want tragedies with villains, mysteries with answers. They want someone to blame, a hand to point at, a conspiracy to unravel. But this was quieter, more insidious. This was the kind of truth that people ignored because it was easier to pretend it wasn't real. The truth was simple. Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had died of misplaced trust. Trust in a system that told them they didn't need doctors, that they didn't need real medicine, that the right combination of herbs and minerals and detoxes would do more for them than any prescription ever could. And in the end, that trust killed them both. I shut my laptop and stood up, stretching the stiffness from my back. The office was quiet. It always was, once the paperwork was filed, once the cases were officially closed. The world moved on. Gene Hackman would be remembered for his films, for his talent, for the life he had lived. Betsy would be remembered for the life she had built with him, the years they had spent together. No one would remember the warning buried in their deaths, because the world wasn't ready to hear it. What I knew, and now so did you.